Take that and just make sure you do that on your...
Yeah, you're good.
Welcome everybody on behalf of the Cultural Affairs Program Committee of St. Joseph's College, which is a subcommittee of the Faculty Senate. We have the Senate President here, Chris Calloway, and another fellow member of the Cultural Affairs Committee here, Ed Riley. And I'm very happy to welcome all of you, and especially to welcome our guest today, Tina Brook. I got to know Tina while we were sailing around the world. And we just got back from an around-the-world voyage on the semester at sea vessel called the World Odyssey. We started in Germany, we went around Africa, up into the Indian Ocean, down through the Strait of Malacca, up to Vietnam, China, Japan, and then back to the United States. On the very last part of this voyage, as we were approaching Honolulu, Tina and a fellow student got up to give the entire shipboard an introduction into Indigenous and Polynesian culture. And I was very impressed with the presentation. I was already impressed with this woman, but just to hear her make a presentation in front of 600 students was most impressive. Tina's a senior at Middlebury College in Vermont, and she'll say a little bit maybe toward the end of what she's planning to do after graduation. She drove over here from Vermont today, so we're very happy to have her speaking on the subject of what is the value of Indigenous culture. So could we all give a St. Joseph's welcome to Tina Brook.
Hello and good afternoon. I'm going to begin as I've been requested to begin, which is how I begin most of my presentations, in the traditional Māori manner. Po kare kare ana, na wai rotorua, fiti atu koi hine, marino ane. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Middlebury toku kora, ko Christina taku ingo. Ko ngāpui toku iwi, ko mamari toku waka, ko omapere toku maunga, ko kaitai Aotearoa toku kāinga, ko urumu heke toku whānau, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Again, good afternoon. You didn't understand a word I just said, but essentially in Māori culture, the way that you introduce yourself is you first call on your ancestors. And to do so, you have to use what your ancestors have given you, which is your body. For men, that involves doing the haka. And if anyone has ever seen a rugby game played by the national New Zealand rugby team, they perform that before every rugby game. And that involves slapping your legs and slapping your arms and yelling very loudly. The whole reason behind that is because it's calling on the way in which we've been given the ability to speak, whereas the spirits aren't given the ability to speak, and so we speak for the spirits. So by singing, by offering a waiata, we bring those ancestors into the room to protect us and to also give us wisdom as we speak, because we are merely human and haven't seen as much as our ancestors have seen. But we should always call on them to offer their wisdom to what we bring to other people through life. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for venturing out today. I'm very thankful to see this many people in the room to hear about a topic that is rarely spoken about. I am not an expert in any way, but I pride myself on being one of the very few people who dedicate my life to studying and fighting for the rights of Indigenous people worldwide. I myself am Māori. I am from New Zealand originally. I spent my high school career mostly in New Zealand, but then left to spend my last 2 years in Canada on Vancouver Island, and then just completed my undergraduate degree. Oh, haven't completed yet, still have a few months left, of my undergraduate degree at Middlebury College in Vermont. And so that brought me to where I am today. And I guess the main point the main point in mentioning all of the places that I have lived in is I have had many opportunities to engage with a number of Indigenous cultures. When I was on Vancouver Island, I was communicating a lot with the Coast Salish community there. And then because of the people that I was interacting with, I had the opportunity to visit every single province and territory in Canada, including Nunavut, where that is the northernmost territory in Canada, and is where the Inuit people live. So I spent a lot of time working with communities there. My specialty is on Indigenous youth education, finding the middle ground between where youth don't feel the need to choose between their Indigenous culture and the Western culture that colonization has essentially made the only option for people to dedicate their lives to. I was faced with that same option when I was 15 years old, to choose between speaking my language and going to an immersion school, or going abroad and pursuing a career in politics, which I intend to do. So I also, when I came to the US, I have not had the specialty honor of working with any Indigenous communities in New England yet. I will be working with an Abenaki community come this spring. But I have worked with the Navajo Reservation in Arizona, and then I've also represented New Zealand at the United Nations on permanent forum in Indigenous issues. So we meet every year, about 5 representatives from around the world, and then 5 representatives from most Indigenous communities in North America, to speak on how the United Nations can serve as a forum for most Indigenous communities who don't have a voice. New Zealand Māori are very privileged to have a place in the political forum in New Zealand, but a lot of communities don't. And so my role in the United Nations is to offer a service of showing how New Zealand does the work that they do with Indigenous communities, and offer that advice to other countries. Okay, without further ado, now that you know everything about my whole life story, I will start talking about what I came here to talk about. So I called this presentation, "What is the Value of Indigenous Knowledge?" because I wanted it to be a play on words. I'm not here to ask what is the value of Indigenous knowledge, because I think quite clearly you understand by now. I think there's a lot of value to it. But I think there is a reason to believe that not a lot of people believe that in the world. And I want to talk about how the value of Indigenous knowledge is its value. So what does it mean to be Indigenous? It's kind of hard to define. There are 370 million Indigenous people in the world, spanned across 70 countries, speaking more than 6,000 languages. In Australia alone, there is 1,234 languages. So it's not quite easy to immediately say when somebody asks you, oh, okay, well, what makes you Indigenous? So what we do instead is we use more of a self-identification process. So this is directly from the farm that I work with in the United Nations, in which we help Indigenous communities to define themselves along their Indigenous lines. So their historical continuity with pre-colonial and or pre-settler societies is our basis of where we start our understanding of whether you're an Indigenous community or not. Strong link to territories and surrounding natural resources, distinct social, economic, or political systems, distinct language, culture, and beliefs. So all of these are very broad guidelines just to understand where we're coming from and how we come together as people. But I think the best definition I've ever seen, which came from the 2005 forum, was Indigenous peoples are the holders of unique languages, knowledge systems, and beliefs, and possess invaluable knowledge of practices for the sustainable management of natural resources. They have a special relation to and use of their traditional land. Their ancestral land has a fundamental importance for their collective physical and cultural survival as peoples. Indigenous peoples hold their own diverse concepts of development based on their traditional values, visions, needs, and priorities. So who are Indigenous people is essentially what you're still asking. Indigenous people span across the whole world. And the reason why I put this map up here is because this is everybody's prerogative. Every single country in the world needs to play a role in the way that Indigenous rights need to be seen and valued. Europe is the only exception where it's not covering the whole continent, but as I'm sure you're all aware, Europe was very involved in the colonization of most of the other countries in which Indigenous communities have suffered from colonization. So I come from here, but have worked with all these communities here, and then met with a few communities along a voyage, which Michael Connolly spoke about in the beginning. So, Indigenous communities in North America. This is a very big map, which is not quite, you can't read anything. But essentially, why I wanted to put this up here was to show that this was Indigenous communities pre-colonial, in pre-colonial setting. And so, all of these Indigenous communities were spread across the whole entire continent. And anywhere you went, there were sacred sites that were dedicated to these Indigenous people's cultural survival. And now today, when you look at the United States, these are where Indigenous communities are forced to live. In terms of, these are the reservations that allow them to practice their certain medicinal or ceremonial practices. They are able to live wherever they please, but in these cases, they are able to operate on a pseudo-sovereignty political system. So these reservations, which I'm sure you all know that there are reservations in your country, these reservations offer small pieces of land that are close to and not necessarily cover all of the sacred spaces that they used to have prior to colonization. And for the sake of me being me, I also have to teach you about my people. So New Zealand, the way that we made it to New Zealand is through Southeast Asia. There was a boat that decided to make its way all the way out to Samoa and then to the Cook Islands in 700. And then from there, 3 different boats navigated their way north, southeast, and southwest down to New Zealand, Papua Nui, and Hawaii. And that was completely based on ancestral wisdom. And so all of our ceremonies and all of our understandings of how we operate with each other and with the world are based on the understanding that we know our ancestors somehow navigated through the Pacific Ocean to find an island in the middle of absolutely nowhere. So if that doesn't tell you this wisdom works, I don't know what will. And it kind of speaks to us every day. in terms of telling us, if this value, if all the knowledge that our ancestors are giving us and our elders are giving us, were given to them in order to make it across the Pacific Ocean, I should probably listen to them. So, how am I going to present to you about 10 million cultures around the world on a very broad scale in one session over 40 minutes? I'm not. But what I wanted to do was take a very Indigenous approach to this presentation and just offer you stories. So all of our cultures have one very similar thing in common. We all practice oral traditions. When I'm operating in the UN world and I'm operating in, I forgot to mention this in the beginning, I do run a nonprofit organization. When I am presenting to schools as part of my nonprofit, all I do is tell stories, because all that I've been taught is to hear stories and learn from them. And that may seem very menial, but the stories in them of themselves teach you how to listen and how to grasp your own understanding from those stories, rather than someone just telling you what to do. So today, I wanted to tell you about how oral traditions through Indigenous cultures have been passed down generationally through storytelling, but have also been altered through colonization, and therefore a lot of these values are not what we see today, and not what you commonly, not you personally, sorry, not what is generally associated with Indigenous people. So these are the three main points that I want to cover: the intrinsic connection to nature, restorative justice, and community, one for all and all for one. The first being intrinsic connection to nature. And I'm sure you all are very aware that this is the most commonly spoken about value that Indigenous people hold. We're in a very pivotal moment in the 21st century where everyone is considering the environmental impacts that we are having on the world. And Indigenous communities worldwide are being called on for their wisdom on how they have survived for many, many years. So my first story is one that I was taught growing up, and it is about Tangaro Whakatoki. So Tangaro is the god of the ocean. We have 7 gods. They all are related to a different part of nature. Tangaro didn't teach me about how I should go into the ocean and swim. No, of course not. But when I learned the story of Tangaro defeating the god monster Taniwha, I was taught about how to respect Tangaro, because Tangaro always protects the ocean. And so through protecting the ocean, I should protect Tangaro. For example, when we go into the ocean, we should always pray to Tangaro to thank him for all of the seafood that he gives us. And then you should never turn your back to Tangaro, because you'll get slapped. Essentially, you'll get hit by a wave. So I won't tell you the full story, but if you ever want to Google it, it's an amazing story. This is just one of the stories you're taught from a child how to operate in so many worlds, because it's not only teaching you about how to operate in the ocean, but it's also how to interact with other people. If they are looking after that space, do not disrespect them, but thank them for having that space for you and for protecting that space for you. The second story I want to tell, I do not know very well. I was only told it last year, but it is from the Abenaki people. And the Abenaki tribe is actually from Maine. And Mount Katahdin, I believe, is also in Maine. And there's a story about how there's a monster that lives on the top of the mountain, and that no one should ever venture too far to the top of the mountain, because the monster will eat them. Well, some of you may say that's absolutely ridiculous. There's no monster going to eat you at the top of the mountain. Indigenous people ascribe to these stories because they know that there have been bad things that have happened in the past. It's not that they have written it down. It's not that they've chronicled it. But it's to say that these areas at the top of the mountains are dangerous. There are many things that have happened to people that shouldn't happen to any more people. And so this story isn't there to tell people necessarily that there is some cosmic creature that is going to kill you if you go up there, but that you should take care, and you should take care of that mountain, because otherwise you will get hurt. Yeah, I think that's the nature of that story. And the last one, which I really love, is in the Inuktitut language, there are 50 words for snow. You really wouldn't think you need 50 words for snow when you look out the window here and you see just white stuff. Why would you need 50 words? Is there any difference between white snow today and white snow tomorrow? Well, for the Inuit people, there's a lot of difference. So matsaruti is for wet snow, and it can be used to ice a sleigh's runners. And so you have to know which snow you're referring to so that you're not using the wrong snow. Pukak is the crystalline powder snow that looks like salt, and so you know that you can go trekking in it. And so people in the Inuit culture use these different words to associate with different snow so that they can not hurt the snow. In terms of, you don't want to use the wrong snow for anything or waste it, because nature has given that snow to us to be used for a purpose. You were given wet snow to be used to ice your sleigh runners. Why does this matter in a 21st century context? Why do you need 50 words for snow when you have a snowblower to get it out of your way? Well, the point isn't about snow. The point is about using these values that are taught from a young age to understand the world that we're living in now, the world that Indigenous communities are forced to live in, and transferring that and adapting that to values today. So, like I said earlier, we are in a pivotal turning point for the environment today. And for me, personally, these values have taught my communities how to help people not deplete more resources, how to help people show that you can protect and you can value natural resources because they are a part of you and they help you breathe. They literally help you breathe. The second point, restorative justice. I know this is becoming a new concept used in the American judicial system, very, very new, but it has long been a tradition in most Indigenous communities to restore justice between those who are in conflict. It is no lie that there were tribal wars between a lot of Indigenous communities in the world, but the point behind restorative justice is not to say that all is forgotten, but that all is forgiven. And so in Maori traditions, we have the aspect of whānau, which literally translates to family. But whānau doesn't mean your bloodline. Whānau means everyone, because we are all born from the same natural cosmic power. And so when we're working through restorative justice processes, we always use this as the starting point. It's not the end point. It's not, oh, okay, let us discuss what happened between the two, and then at the end we'll understand that we're both humans anyway. But it's a matter of fact from the very beginning, because that's what you're taught from a young age, is that there is no hierarchy, but there are levels of respect. So there's no one who's telling you what to do or has superiority over you, but you do have a matua and whaia, which literally translates to older woman or older father, who has more wisdom than you. And that doesn't mean that they're more superior than you, but that they have more to offer you and more to teach you. And so we, from a young age, understand that it's not that they get to eat first or they get to speak first because they have something intrinsically and inherently more superior than you, but it's because they need that nutrients before you so they can offer you nutrients through wisdom. Oh, one thing I would like to add on that is we actually use this in our prison systems. And that's how we have brought together a lot of different gang members from different sides of prison systems to bring them together to come back to these historical traditions. So the Navajo Nation, of which I worked with for 4 months, has this prayer that starts with Hojo Nahashli and ends with Hojo Nahashli. And these words mean, I walk in beauty. The prayer, when translated, speaks about, with beauty in front of me I walk, with beauty behind me I walk, with beauty beside me I walk, with beauty above me I walk, with beauty below me I walk. What this means is that they're calling on the fact that they are a part of the universe and the universe walks with them, and that everyone is a part of that universe, and so you should always walk together. So this is used not only at the ending of ceremonies, but when people come together to talk about their tribal wars between each other. Again, what does this matter in a 21st century context? We're not suffering from tribal wars like we were 200 years ago. But I don't think I need to tell you there are many wars in the world. And there are many conflicts on a smaller scale, particularly in this country at the moment. These values take this from a bigger scale down to the very smallest scale, because they teach people from the smallest beings that you are human just as anybody else. And when we listen to these stories growing up, it's not about learning about beauty walking before you or beauty behind you, but that you must always walk in this idea that you should never treat another human as if they are less of you. So the last one is an interesting point that usually isn't discussed. And it means, it kind of is the reason why colonization happened. We have a value for community, that one is for all and all is for one. And what that means is that when Captain Cook arrived on the shores of New Zealand, we invited him in as community, because that is what it means to be community, is that no matter who you are, no matter where you came from, no matter what you do, you are a part of the community, and we will give to you as we expect you to work and be a part of the community too. So the Coast Salish community operates on this idea. And so they have a hunter-gatherer tribal mentality to this day. And so they go hunting for salmon, deer, and whales, because they're off the coast of Seattle and Vancouver. And they actually have special legal rights to hunt as much as they please. And that is because they don't overhunt. Their mentality is, I'm going out to hunt to get food. A lot of people, especially in New England, go out to hunt for food. But what they usually do is they go out to hunt for enough food for perhaps the winter. Well, under the Coast Salish and a lot of other Indigenous communities' mentality, when you go out to hunt, you go to gather enough for the whole entire tribe. You should never come back for just enough for your immediate family, because that's just not the way you do things. If you are going out for one person, then you are going out for all. And then the Māori people of New Zealand have a really beautiful word, which I try to live by every day, and it's called Manake Tonga. Manake Tonga loosely translates to hospitality, but honestly I don't think that does it justice. It can be broken down to 3 separate understandings, where mana is prestige, and kitanga is to the people. When you put that together, it's saying that you should give prestige to all people. That doesn't mean that you should hold anyone above yourself, but it means that anyone who walks into your door as a guest now becomes somebody you hold in prestige and you give status to, which means you offer them absolutely everything. I'm personally adopted, and I've moved around since I was 15, so I haven't had a place called home, but I've experienced Manake Tonga everywhere I have been, because people, as soon as I walk into their home, are so kind and loving that they offer themselves to me. They offer the status that any human being deserves, because we are community. I'm sure you're getting sick of this slide. Why does this matter in a 21st century context? You know what? I think that it not only matters because we need to become more of a collective society, away from this individualistic idea of collecting for yourself and collecting for your own gain, but it's also very important to me and my people and Indigenous communities around the world to understand why these atrocities occurred, And oftentimes why our history is overlooked is because we still, to this day, will treat anyone who comes onto our land, and I speak the royal we for Māori people, I can't speak for other Indigenous communities today, that we will invite anyone in. I have an anecdote to share where I was at a funeral where someone was murdered in my community, and the murderer actually came to the funeral, and we invited them onto our land, because it doesn't matter who you are or what you have done, you are still human and you still deserve that feeling of community. And it might be the idea that you lacked community that you committed that murder, and we wouldn't want that to happen again. So yeah, I think that this personally is the strongest point that I had to share with you today. So what is the present situation for Indigenous people? Well, we've been removed from our lands. So a lot of these values we can't actually practice anymore because the nature of teaching them involved visiting these sacred lands to teach about why this mountain is sacred or why this certain aspect of hunting and gathering is sacred. The Coast Salish people are lucky in that they have the legal rights to hunt, but a lot of communities in the world are not that lucky. We have been subject to a number of assimilative practices, residential schools being one of those in North America, whereby traditions and ceremonies, not only are they not practiced, but they're not valued anymore because we were taught time and time again to not speak our language and to not practice our culture. And so today, when we try to teach these to younger children, they don't want to hear it because A, that's not going to make you any money, or B, what is the value? People have taught us for years that these are wrong. So from that, we've lost language, lost culture, and lost our voice. And we have turned to a lot of unfortunate ways of dealing with that. We have absurdly high alcoholism, substance abuse, and violence that is a standard across Indigenous communities across the world. So how do we deal with that? Well, I'm lucky to work on a body, one of the only bodies in the world that deals with these kind of issues. So we come together every year as the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to talk on these different topics, to hear what is going on, what progress has been made, and what advice we can gather in order to help more communities around the world. And we created a document, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that was released in 2007. And it is currently legally binding for all parties that are involved in the UNPFII, besides the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Guatemala. Arguably 5 of the most important countries to be involved in this declaration. So we're working on that at the moment. But what I think this is a sign of is a moving forward. We're moving forward with the way in which to bring these values into a legal body so that we have standing in the Western world. A lot of elders are against this idea because it's the idea of assimilation. But we have to adapt. We have no choice. So there are a lot of other bodies that are also working on it. The World Intellectual Property Organization actually dedicates one of their positions to pro bono work for Indigenous knowledge. And so that's essentially giving legal rights to art, to music, and to languages so that they can be preserved and also not taken for granted by other communities who choose to use them. The World Bank and the IMF now have a sector in their organizations which is dedicated to speaking with Indigenous communities about the money that they have put to developing different countries such as the Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, and how Indigenous communities are being treated through that money for development. Yeah, so there is some hope. There is some hope for what this will overcome, but I think the main issue is that these values still aren't seen as something that should be practiced in the 21st century. And it isn't up to these bodies to do that. It's up to these bodies to give those people legal rights. It's up to people on the ground to start changing their view on how they should treat Indigenous people or how they should look at their practices. It's not something that happened years and years ago in terms of people don't practice that kind of stuff anymore. No, medicinal practices and ceremonies are practiced every single day, and they're super helpful to people's livelihoods. So that's the takeaway message that I wanted to offer here today. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, and I offer you to ask any questions. Thank you.
So first of all, can you talk a little bit about how the nation state of New Zealand has dealt with your culture, basically your culture, and how you say at some level they started to recognize the importance, when previously obviously they didn't, right? So how did that evolve? What were some of the processes in that?
Sure. So I worked with Hone Harawira, which is the leader of the Manu Party, which is the Maori political party in New Zealand. And he from a young age was very into campaigning against the rights that Maori were overlooked for. And he actually was the forefront of creating essentially a second parliamentary system for Maori people. So now in New Zealand, as someone who is both Maori and a New Zealand citizen, I vote twice. So I vote first in the general elections, which is for a representative of my area, and then secondly for a representative on the Maori electoral, which is specifically someone put into Parliament every single year to serve as a voice for all of the communities in my area. And so he essentially, and a number of other people, of course, were involved in pushing for that right to have another electoral role.
So just to follow up, so how does it work in the education system there, like beyond just formal politics?
But beyond formal politics, we are eligible for funding for immersion schools. And then Māori is not required. Te reo Māori, which is the language, nor the culture is required for students to learn in elementary nor in high school. So we're still pushing for that. But that is the education component. My nonprofit actually works on education and how we bring in Indigenous knowledge into the Western context. So we're pushing more for the education aspect. But when it comes to actually speaking on, for example, land preservation, for the rights to hunting and gathering, the Māori electoral just has a voice. They don't have the lead on that. So I'm assuming that's what you're speaking to, is that when it comes to the practicality of what we get to have a say in and what actually happens, it's the fact that we now have a seat at the table, but we don't necessarily get to lead the discussion. So for example, we put forth the Foreshore and Seabed Act, which gave New Zealand Māori the right to fisheries and to operate the fisheries that were on Indigenous lands. And it was denied by the government because it didn't serve the economic prerogatives of the government. And so we're moving towards giving more legal rights and standing to Māori people, but we're still not at a state where we get a say in anything per se. We just have a voice.
I'll ask one more question then What would you say the relationship with technology and this broader movement for Indigenous rights is? A positive relationship, the internet, social media, just thinking about the 21st century and organizing for some of these things.
Yeah, so it's a good question, especially with the Idle No More movement that occurred in the past decade in North America, which was led via social media. And so a lot of elders in Indigenous communities see technology as a way of people moving away from their traditional roots. Sorry. But what we're seeing now is a generational shift because those people are now passing away because of old age. We are moving away from that idea of traditional knowledge as only being an aspect outside of technology and finding ways to adapt to that. So we're still in the stage where there is a lot of opposition in many Indigenous communities around the world. Particularly in North America, we're moving very quickly towards the idea that technology is seen as a tool rather than an opposite to traditional knowledge, if that answers your question. Yeah.
In your mind or your opinion, who are the most persecuted Indigenous people on Earth, and which countries are doing the most to reconcile with their Indigenous population? Is there a...
Most persecuted by number, or?
No, just which populations just having the hardest time?
Currently, as of today, the Rohingya people of Myanmar, which, if anyone reads a newspaper ever, should know about. It's a community in the northernmost part of Myanmar that is being executed based on their indigenous roots. And that's not the only place, that's not an isolated incident, where that actually happens a lot in Latin America, where people are just executed based on the fact that they speak their language or they have a certain heritage. That happened in North America with the Trail of Tears, where a lot of communities were pushed out of New England to the Southwest. So I would say that that is the community that is the worst off. And the international community, I would say, doesn't really have a stake in it right now, mostly because of the politics within Myanmar and that it's run by an authoritative regime. And I think that's unfair and that's unjust, but that is.
Now, and how about the nation that's trying to do the most?
Well, actually we are. Yeah. So the New Zealand Māori are constantly renowned as the community that is doing the best. And as I hope you have heard me say today, that's still not well off. That is not at a good state in my opinion. I'm most definitely an exception to the rule standing before you today with almost an undergraduate degree. I do not have any friends who graduated high school. And so to say that that is the norm is disappointing for the best Indigenous community in the world in terms of political leeway.
I have to ask this, and I don't feel like it's facetious, but I think it intersects a lot of respect for what you're curious about the table. Is that cultural appropriation, or is it a celebration of culture, or a mixture of both?
First of all, I haven't seen it by choice. I think after seeing Pocahontas, it kind of scared me a little bit. But the producers of Moana visited 6 different nations that have a stake in the story of Maui. And from the response that I've heard is that Maui is represented in a way that is diluted from how he is represented in our culture. Which isn't to say it's wrong, but it's to say that there was no need for that. The story of Maui, I was taught when I was 3 years old. It is a completely child-friendly story, yet Disney felt the need to change that. I am not ready to take on that project of analyzing why, but I think that there needs to be a case to examine that. But from what I've heard, there's a great reception about how it brings about Maui into new outlooks of children, because most people in the world don't consider Polynesian culture when they think of Indigenous communities. So that's a good step. But personally, not ready to dilute my culture. But,
is there sort of a general consensus coming out of Polynesian people stuff?
Yeah. So it's generally positive. Generally positive because it does a good job at least displaying the story, a small segment of it, and a lot of Polynesian cultures have actually remade the movie in our languages. So we've remade it in Māori and moved it towards the original story in doing so. Yeah, but generally a positive outlook, because at least now we have a world audience to one of our most dearest stories. Yeah, we'll go up there.
I was curious if, following up on the technology question, if there were any projects coming out of your immersion schools that are like the one that came out of a circumpolar inner group that produced a video game, and the drawings, the music, the language, the knowledge that you had to have as a character in the video game to survive, etc. Like, it was really very, very well done. And but that's still pretty unique, and it's of course expensive to do. But I was just curious if there are any pilot projects like that in your own.
Yeah, a lot of them actually. So when I was on the Navajo reservation, I worked with my colleague, and he created an app in the Diné culture, which Diné is the word for people in the Navajo culture. For the Diné people, when you introduce yourself by clan, and that immediately identifies who you are in terms of your tribe, so that you know whether you're family or not. And so he created an app where you can find your lineage, and it will tell you how to say your clan, because not many people, I shouldn't say not many people, there's a decline in those who speak the Navajo language right now, and so that offers an opportunity for people to at least understand where their lineage is coming from. And then there's an app to learn Te Reo Māori. Actually, my brother was working on another app for Māori stories. I think it's slow because we obviously have to tread carefully with elders who still believe that it's an opposition. But it is definitely something that a lot of Indigenous youth are turning towards as a way of also stepping into that adaptation away from finding the middle ground between going to school and also keeping your tradition close. Yeah.
What's the reaction of your family and the people in your Māori community around the kinds of things that you're doing around the world?
Yeah, great question. Very personal, so I apologize for that. It's unfortunately negative because I am a woman. My immediate tribe is very traditional in comparison to a lot of other tribes, and so my family and my Māori community do not believe necessarily in the positive aspects of women going to school, because women are childbearers, and that may seem oppressive in a Western context, but that's actually a huge place of prestige in our cultures, because it says that you are the closest to Mother Nature and you have an integral part in the community to bring life. So I respect that wholeheartedly, but from a young age I knew that I wanted to pursue education and wanted to pursue political forums where I could help Indigenous communities moving into the Western world at a level of adaptation, not just sticking with that traditional world. Thank you for the question. Yeah, did you have a question?
So I live next to a couple Indian reservations, and they both actually have casinos, which create like a lot of job opportunity and even help like send some of my friends to school and whatnot. How do you feel about casinos?
Yeah, so casinos operate in a few Indigenous reservations in North America as a form of, obviously, income. And that has been a movement to give people money where they otherwise didn't feel that they had the skills to go out and earn money. Honestly, I think there's two sides to the story. The first is that it's very positive because Indigenous communities don't have the ability to self-preserve anymore. They don't have the ability to go out and hunt as much as they need to survive, and so they need some form of survival. And because they do have the unique level of pseudo-sovereignty to operate a casino without the necessary taxes, that's a great way to do it. But then there's the other side, which is it creates a gambling problem and a substance abuse problem as a way of dealing with the issues that Indigenous communities face. So I guess there's no way of saying if it's right or wrong, but I think that there's a way to operate within with having that in the community, which is to deal with those substance abuse issues and deal with the mental health issues that lead to people needing to turn to those substances or gambling as a way of dealing with that. And therefore that would create a positive addition to the community rather than a negative. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I have a lot of neighbors where I live who are Micmac Indian or part Micmac, and they have for a long time been trying to organize, in fact, succeeding in organizing a kind of social structure which includes people of part Native American descent. How much of an issue is this across indigenous communities, trying to include people who are only part indigenous versus have full indigenous lineage?
That's a great question. I think I want to start by saying that that is one of the issues that completely depends on the indigenous community, because I think there's a wide array of responses to that. For example, I don't know if you noticed, I have white skin, so I'm not full-blooded Maori. I am half British, but for the Maori people, we have very few full-blooded Maori people left, and so we are very welcoming to the idea that most people do not immediately present with brown skin, and so we have a lot of people who have blonde hair and are of half Maori descent. So we're a very welcoming community when it comes to inviting people in who aren't necessarily full-blooded. I would say that in communities that I've worked with in the US, it's more a case of first and foremost legality because of the nature of reservations. For some reservations, in order to be considered a Native American, you have to have a certain amount of blood in you that is indigenous or native in order to qualify for certain benefits. And I think that begins the question to say, okay, so who makes you native? Do you have to speak the language? Do you have to practice certain things? Do you have to have lived on the reservation for a number of years? And that was never a question before, because no one had ever asked that before that became a legality. So I think it totally depends on which community has that really strong legal aspect to whether you get benefits, on whether they're welcoming. At the same time, I think that that's another way of pointing to what I talked about in my presentation, is that that value of community has been diluted by that legality and because of colonial assimilative practices. So my answer to you is, I don't know. But there are many elements to that that come from legal and just all-around individual approaches to what it means to be Native. Yeah, sorry I couldn't answer that more. Yeah.
There's a debate in studies of language about whether, especially indigenous languages, are able to, they have words for things that can't be fully translated into other languages, and therefore the risk of having these languages die out is that we are literally losing knowledge that way, because we won't be able to describe or refer to things that can only be understood from within that language. But that's controversial, so do you have a view on that? Are there things in Maori that can only be understood in that language that can't be fully explained in the languages?
Yeah, I mean, you've witnessed me trying to explain what Manake Tonga is. There is no way to translate it. I think that because of the nature of dying languages involves losing half of cultures. You know, it can be up to that much. That's become such an important issue for us to deal with. I think that makes it the most highest priority for us is to preserve those languages. I don't know many cases of that in the U.S. in which there are actually certain physical things that you wouldn't be able to describe anymore. But I think for the most part, it's about connecting people back to their traditions and their ceremonies. And I think it's very important, but at the same time, you can teach the ceremony without the language, and I've seen that many times before. In Hawaii, for example, only 3 people spoke Hawaiian in 1980, yet they've continued all the traditions, which have now become more touristic, but they continued all those traditions without the language. And then from those traditions, we're able to bring back the language because now 20,000 people speak the language. So it can work either way. I think it's the matter of just making sure that you're staying with those traditions in order to keep those different aspects and values alive. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure exactly how I want to ask my question, but I've been thinking about activism and in the world of activism, especially around the subject of water rights. I think just about everybody in the room has probably been exposed to some information of that via social media or whatever. And so there's an implication there about how peoples interact and maybe in the spirit of helping or not helping. And, you know, good point of view varying depending on your own personal level of what you believe you should be doing to be an activist. So I wondered if you had any views on how people here might view what a diplomatic approach to in the context, let's say, of maybe of UN, you know, where you're obviously getting a lot of your training from and a lot of the spirit of your thinking. What kind of diplomacy can people who are non-Indigenous take to approach situations that might call for activism in the areas where our interests overlap? Does that come across?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a hard one, so I'm taking a moment. I think, again, it gets back to there's an array of responses that will be given by different Indigenous communities, so I'm not going to stand here and give you a blanketed response, because I'm not going to immediately recommend that you go out and picket for a certain community who might see that as disrespectful. But I think for the most part, for example, the I Don't Know More movement was open to a lot of different communities. So I think the more diplomatic response is to help Indigenous communities on a broader stance. For example, Keystone Pipeline might seem like it was an issue that was to only help the Sioux tribe, but through helping the Sioux tribe, that gives a precedent for every other Indigenous community in the world. For example, we campaigned in New Zealand for years and years, and this may sound strange to people who aren't Indigenous, to give legal human rights to a river. So the Wanganui River is now considered the child of a tribe. And the reason why that's so good is because then now we can take the New Zealand government to court for child violation because they were disrespecting the river by polluting it. And that gave precedence for a lot of other places in the world, including India, to do the same thing. And so I think the best approach is to take a broad approach, because what happens with a lot of communities, Indigenous communities, is that their responses to outsiders have become very defensive. So the diplomatic approach should be to help on a broader sense. I hope that helps.
One more.
Yeah, sure.
Is there a student that has a question? One of the most impressive things about having Tina here today is that, like yourselves, she is a student.
Yeah, I'm 21 years old.
So is there a student that has a question for her, and then we'll let Mark ask the final question?
Very good.
Yeah.
You spoke about your community and how they view women, and I just wanted to know how difficult it was for you to leave in high school, go to Canada, things like that, become part of the UN. Just, you're here right now.
Yeah. No other word than hard to use. No, I think it was actually the easiest thing I've ever done because I knew how much I could do outside of my community. And I know that sounds so heroic and whatnot, but it was just the matter of fact that I saw my community turning to the same thing year and generation after generation, which for the most part is substance abuse. And so I knew that wasn't what I wanted for my life. And I didn't know how to stop that being a thing for my life, because you hit an age in my community and you immediately turn to that. And I was lucky enough to have lived in a community that was close to, essentially what it was a pseudo reservation in New Zealand that was close to a town that was predominantly non-Māori, and people who helped me see that there is education and you're allowed to have education. So it's easy in the philosophical sense, but the reason why I'm adopted is because my biological parents wouldn't sign the papers for me to leave the country, so actually somebody from the non-Māori community adopted me so that they could sign the papers. Yeah, so it was hard in practicality, and a lot of money, but yeah, I think easy because I knew I would be standing on a stage like this one day and in the UN one day, helping more than I could help by just staying there. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a big question. And it speaks to a lot of the themes that you presented here, but my sense is, if you think of 500 years of European colonization, right, it's done a lot of damage, obviously, globally. It seems like maybe we've hit the bottom of that relationship with indigenous cultures, and maybe in the 21st century we're starting to trend all those slowly in the right direction. Is that your sense of where we're going? You say there's hope, there's these things, there's generational aspects.
Sure.
For example, so where do you see we're in 50 years we are on this, or 75 years?
Well, first I see my country half underwater, first one, which is fun fact, actually scientifically proven. Yeah, but practically. In 50 years, I see that Indigenous languages are spoken as a second language by people who are not Indigenous. And I first and foremost think that's beautiful, because, for example, in New Zealand, only 15% of the population is Māori, and so Māori is never spoken. But I see that there's a trend not only to understanding what it offers for Indigenous people, but like I pointed out in my presentation, what it offers for other people, and that you can describe things that you can't describe in any other language. So that's what I see in 50 years, which is a tall ask. The other thing that I see is that similarities to the Māori way of electing people happening not only in the US, but also in Canada, probably first Canada. And then the third one, which I think is most important, and we're working on very closely at the moment, is Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Not in the same respect that it was done in South Africa, Rwanda, India, but pseudo-TRC proceedings that can help people move past the past, but not forget that it happened, and from there build a future that helps both communities live together. Yeah, so those are the three things I can think of immediately, but the world 50 years from now, I mean, if you had asked 4 years ago what the world would look like in 4 years, I'm sure we wouldn't have said half the things that are happening right now. So I'm sure a lot of things will happen in 50 years, but that's what I hope to see, and that's where I see the political trend going towards right now.
I think after listening to Tina, you will all know why I asked her to come to St. Joseph's College. She's the most remarkable student, the most remarkable woman, and more importantly, a most remarkable human being. And we're so happy that she spent her time with us today.
I forgot to mention, if anyone who is a student wants my information to hear about how I've done half of the things I've done by the age of 21, please feel free to come ask me for my email or anything.